This is the story of the day humanity lost the moon, at a time when no one bothered to lift their head and look up, and the roar of cities had locked us inside their own noise. The day we forgot the idea of the Great Silence, humanity fell in love with its own static. The sky had become an old stage set, forgotten behind neon signs. Skyscrapers were not just concrete and glass, they stood like colossal antennas woven from control and hubris, and our deaf ears now listened only to the signals that came from them. Earth's orbit had turned into a clogged highway, packed with satellites, defense platforms, and drifting scrap. Humanity had already planted its flag on Mars, in the moon's valleys, mining camps labored day and night. On the moon's uncanny dark side stood a small, solitary outpost, Kersonen 3. One of the few scientists working there was the astrophysicist Dr. Darin Yunisi. He had inherited the curiosity of his ancestors who once traced shapes in the night sky above old Mosul's observatories, and since childhood he had never stopped asking questions of the heavens. To him, the moon was not a mere resource depot, but a delicate gravitational hinge locking Earth's balance in place. He could always see the truth hiding behind the numbers. That morning, there was an operation on the lunar surface that had long since become routine, widening a mining shaft with a controlled explosion. For the contractors, this was a completely standard procedure. But the blast triggered a deeper structural weakness in the ground than expected. An old, porous network of lava tubes collapsed, and a massive subsidence crater several kilometers wide opened up. The company was pleased with the outcome, because the instruments were spitting out rich streams of valuable ore data. They didn't care that the blasted zone had quickly turned into a dark, gaping pit. Yet this gigantic crater they barely paid attention to caused a change in the moon's mass distribution that looked trivial at first glance. The moon's center of mass had shifted on the scale of millimeters, but even a displacement that small was enough to seriously disturb its dynamical balance. On Kersonen 3's main display, the ellipse tracing the moon's orbit still looked almost perfect. But when Darin overlaid the post-blast data onto the previous weeks, he noticed a slight kink at the edge of that perfect line. The orbit was drifting from the theoretical model by parts in the trillion, normally the kind of difference you would just shrug off as statistical noise. What caught Darin's eye, however, was the strange direction of the parabolic deviation. Darin left a brief note in the log system: persistent deviation above standard tolerance detected in the moon's orbital dynamics. I request a detailed scan and a formal review session from the Observation Council. Kersonen 3, Dr. Darin Yunisi. Instead of trying to understand the full orbital behavior of the deviation, the other units looked only at short time windows and made their decision from there. Without ever taking in the whole parabolic curve, they slapped a minor fluctuation label on the anomaly based on brief back-sequence charts and shot the report down by an overwhelming majority. The file never even came close to clearing the system approval threshold. Still, Darin didn't back down. He went first to the station director, opened up every layer of his analysis and all the simulation outputs, and argued that the blast might have altered the moon's mass distribution. But the director, whose tour on the station was nearly over and whose mind was already halfway back on Earth, didn't really take it seriously. When his supervisor, sounding more bored than concerned, asked, "All right then, what exactly are you proposing?" Darin first called for an immediate halt to all mining operations, a request for support from Earth, and for at least part of the mass they had stolen from the moon to be given back until help arrived. The derelict stations and heavy modules drifting idly in orbit would be steered, via controlled maneuvers, down into the newly formed crater, so the imbalance caused by the shift could be at least partially compensated. He stressed that a real, lasting solution would require a specialist team and instrumentation as advanced as the arrays on the Mars bases. The station director did not consider these overblown demands worth even arguing about. He simply fulfilled his procedural duty, approving the request so that Darin's proposal would be forwarded through official channels to the security advisor of the Lunar United Nations Senator, Laura van der Meer. Laura, meanwhile, was on Earth time, watching a live-streamed concert by her favorite rap artist. When the station request popped up on her console, she opened it once, glanced at the voting summary, and, without even reading the contents of the file, rejected it with a single, casual tap. 8 hours had passed since the vote. During that time, Darin had kept his instruments running, taking measurement after measurement, tracking the situation without a pause. When he examined the latest data, he saw that the deviation in the moon's orbital oscillation was, each time, producing parabolic bends larger than he had expected. Meanwhile, in the other units, most observers had already entrusted the routine data stream to automatic systems. As long as the models were not updated and the threshold values were not officially crossed, no one was going to notice that something had gone wrong. And by the time they did, it would already be far too late. For that reason, Darin moved immediately. He was now fully convinced that the true source of the anomaly was the massive collapse crater opened by the blast, and the chain of subsurface cave-ins it had triggered beneath it. This time, he refused to leave anything to chance. He prepared a new, top priority, emergency dossier that did not only describe the orbital deviation, but also mapped the collapse geometry, quantified the mass shift, and outlined long-term risk scenarios. He sent the file back to the Council with a formal request for a full evaluation meeting. In the request section, it was stated explicitly that the matter should be officially escalated to the lunar UN senator. When the meeting ended, most of the Council still had not managed to step out from under the shadow of their previous decision. The possibility that their earlier rejection might be proven wrong gnawed at their pride, and Darin's warning still sounded to them too theoretical, too far-fetched. So they ruled that the deviation was still a negligible figure, and that linking it to mining activity, let alone taking immediate action, should be considered exaggerated and unnecessary. Simply keeping the relevant values under passive observation for a few more days was deemed sufficient. Even so, Darin's detailed calculations and his new collapse crater model were enough to open a fine crack in the certainty of a few members. In the vote that followed, the minority in his favor only just cleared the critical threshold. Under the procedure, once support rises above 30%, the majority decision formally remains in force, but the petitioner gains the right to take the dossier directly to the senator. From that point on, the moment Darin chose to invoke that right, the file would be obliged to appear on the senator's agenda as an official item. In response to his request, Darin was given a 30-minute slot, scheduled 4 hours later, to present his case directly to the senator. He hurried onto a small shuttle and set course for the central station. When he stepped into the senator's office, the senator greeted him only with a sideways glance and kept studying the wide holographic displays floating in front of his desk. For the first few minutes, it didn't even look as if he was truly paying attention. But a short while after Darin began to speak, the senator slowly drew his gaze away from the screens and turned it toward him. Even then, there was less genuine understanding in that look than a kind of hollow, exhausted stare. He let Darin speak to the very end without interrupting, and when the explanation was over, his eyes slid back, almost as if nothing had been said, to the bright charts and graphs showing mining output and production targets. Only then did he close those windows and open Darin's report. Inside the file were signed notes from 6 of the 17 council members explicitly linking the anomaly to lunar mining. After skimming through the document, he lifted his head again. "Very well," he said. "If this assumption is correct, what exactly do you propose? What stance do you think we should take?" Darin drew a deep breath and laid out his solutions one by one. An immediate shutdown of all mining operations, a formal request for expert support from Earth, bringing the issue to the public and the press if necessary to create political pressure, and redirecting dead stations and heavy orbital modules, via controlled maneuvers, down into the collapse crater to partially counterbalance the mass shift. In short, the kind of measures that would give any senator a pounding headache, things no politician ever wants to hear. After a brief silence, the senator let his eyes wander across the empty wall opposite him, then spoke in a calm yet cutting tone. "Let's be honest," he said. "This plan is politically hard to defend, economically very expensive, and from a technical standpoint would only create unnecessary panic at this stage. It will be wiser to collect more data, run new measurements, and reassess the situation in 2 days." At that moment, a secretary stepped into the room carrying a stack of files, silently signaling that the meeting time was over. The dossier had been shelved once again. Darin left the office with his shoulders sagging and started back toward his shuttle. In the same corridor, the senator's deputy for lunar security, Laura van der Meer, was walking in the opposite direction. The look on Darin's face was unsettling enough that, without quite knowing why, she found her own steps slowing as he passed. Less than a day had passed since the conversation when the indicators began to vindicate Darin with brutal clarity. On the moon, the experts threw standard protocols aside and called for an emergency meeting, but this time, the problem no longer belonged to the moon alone, it belonged to Earth as well. The very next day, strange tides were recorded along the planet's coastlines, and ocean models started flashing red alerts. The moon no longer traced a clean ring in its orbit, it lurched forward in a spiraling deviation, as if shoved and tugged by an invisible hand. The old companion that had stubbornly held its course for ages was finally beginning to lose its strength. The situation quickly became the world's top priority. Environmental security councils, climate and ocean modelers, geophysicists, all were hastily called into the same rooms. When the deviations in tide forecasts were laid side by side with the drift in the moon's orbit, the picture that emerged was almost unbearable to look at. At this point, stopping it was nearly a matter of miracles. And if that miracle did not come, Earth's satellite would either draw too close, shattering within the planet's gravity well and sending its fragments to tear the world itself to pieces, or its orbital momentum would overpower Earth's pull, setting the moon free, and the Earth, left without it, would be dragged into a slow, cold and irreversible death.